I'm a 35-year-old guy, financially stable, single, and up until recently I thought I was just a really good brother. My younger brother, who's in his late 20s, has had his share of setbacks since our parents passed away a few years ago. Layoffs, breakups, a stolen wallet here, a car repair bill there. It always seemed like he was facing one hurdle after another. Being the older brother, I felt responsible for him. Without parents around, I figured it was up to me to look out for him, so I helped where I could. A few $100 here and there started small, but before I knew it, I'd been bailing him out of situations for years. It started with some bills, mostly rent, utilities, and groceries. He'd call me up, sounding stressed, talking about how his paycheck fell short or how he got hit with some unexpected fee. Each time I'd pay it off, thinking, it's family, I can handle it. He always promised he'd pay me back someday, but I never really expected it. I figured once he got on his feet, it would all balance out. Besides, he was family. What was I going to do? Just let him sink? The debt payments began adding up slowly, though. A couple of thousand here, a few more there. At one point, he called me in a panic, saying he'd gotten in over his head with some credit card bills. He told me it was all from trying to make ends meet, groceries, rent, basic stuff. I agreed to help, but only if he cut back and started saving. He promised he would. I paid off the credit cards and thought maybe this was a fresh start for him. But as the months went by, more emergencies popped up. I can't even count how many times his car seemed to break down, how often he was robbed or somehow lost his wallet. Every time it was some new misfortune, and every time I paid. Some of my friends started raising their eyebrows. They'd hear me talking about yet another loan to my brother and would say things like, "Doesn't this seem a little too convenient?" Or, "Man, that's a lot of bad luck." But I brushed it off. I trusted him. He was my brother. Then I saw the first red flag that really made me stop and think. I visited him one weekend and noticed a brand new gaming console sitting on his coffee table. Not just the console, but a stack of games too. Now, I know how much those things cost, and it didn't sit right with me. Here I was, covering his rent and bills because he was supposedly strapped for cash, yet he had money for this? I casually brought it up, asking how he could afford the console. He shrugged it off, saying it was a gift from a friend. Something about that explanation felt off, but I let it slide. Maybe he was telling the truth, and I was reading too much into it. A few weeks later, he called again, asking for help with another emergency. This time, it was a medical bill. I don't remember the exact amount, but it was high enough to make me hesitate. I wanted to believe him, but something didn't feel right. I agreed, but I told him that this was it, the last time I was helping unless he started showing me some responsibility. He agreed, of course, swearing up and down that he'd get it together, but my trust was shaken. I found myself questioning everything. Was I really helping him, or was I just enabling him? I decided that, this time, I needed to know exactly what was going on with his finances. I asked him for full transparency if he wanted my help again. His reaction surprised me. He got defensive, refusing to share any details. That response only made me more determined to get to the bottom of things. So I took matters into my own hands. I started looking closer at what I could find out. The first thing I did was check his social media, something I rarely did before, because I didn't feel the need to keep tabs on him. But this time, I wanted to know if he was as strapped for cash as he claimed. Scrolling through his posts, I was shocked. There he was, posing at bars, going to fancy dinners, even on what looked like vacations. It didn't add up. If he was in such dire straits, why did he look like he was living it up? I reached out to a few mutual friends to ask if they knew anything about his financial situation. One friend said he'd seen my brother at a high-end store just the week before, buying clothes. Another mentioned he'd heard rumors that my brother was involved in gambling, which explained the sudden need for money. The more I heard, the more it started to feel like I'd been played. It wasn't just about him being irresponsible. It was that he'd been hiding things from me, lying to me. All those stories about bad luck and emergencies were starting to look more like excuses. I couldn't believe it. After everything I'd done for him, he'd been taking advantage of me. But I wasn't going to jump to conclusions just yet. I needed to know the full story, to understand exactly what was happening with his finances. I decided to investigate further, not to confront him just yet, but to gather as much information as I could. I wanted to give him one last chance to come clean. That's where things started unraveling. The deeper I dug, the more secrets I uncovered, and it was only the beginning. Update 1. Gup. After discovering the photos of my brother living what looked like a pretty comfortable life on social media, I knew I couldn't just leave it there. I was already covering his rent, bills, and random emergency expenses. I had a right to know what was going on. So, I decided to dig into his financial records, something I'd never felt compelled to do before. I got a hold of one of his credit card statements. It wasn't easy to do, but I convinced him it was part of a budgeting exercise that would help him get back on track. He reluctantly handed over the statement, probably thinking I wouldn't scrutinize it. I didn't even get past the first page before I felt my stomach drop. There were charges at high-end restaurants, bar tabs that went well into the hundreds, and purchases from expensive clothing stores. My brother, who constantly pleaded poverty and needed my help to get by, had somehow been affording a luxury lifestyle. I decided to go through multiple statements. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Regular charges for designer clothes, cocktails at rooftop bars, and even a hotel stay here and there. He wasn't just getting by, he was living it up. I thought back to all the times he had called me in a panic, talking about bills he couldn't pay and essentials he couldn't afford, and I realized I'd been funding a life I knew nothing about. I decided to confront him about it, but I wanted to give him a chance to explain. So I asked him about a few specific charges. Instead of showing any kind of remorse or explanation, he laughed it off, saying things like, "Oh, that was a gift," or "My friends covered that one." Every answer felt like another slap in the face. It was clear he didn't think he'd done anything wrong, and that's when I felt something shift. I knew I had to set some boundaries. But before I could even think about making a final decision, my curiosity got the better of me. I logged back into his social media and looked deeper. It wasn't just the one post I'd seen earlier. There were several photos of him at swanky places, tagging himself at resorts, and even a few selfies from what looked like weekend trips. I was stunned. This wasn't just occasional spending, this was an entire lifestyle he'd crafted, and I'd been footing the bill for it. I reached out to a few mutual friends, casually bringing up some of the places I'd seen in his photos. I didn't want to outright accuse him of anything, but I wanted some context. One friend admitted that my brother had been bragging about his success and even mentioned he was living his best life. That was the first time it hit me just how much he'd been hiding. He wasn't just struggling, he was actively misleading me and everyone around him. More friends came forward with stories of his wild nights out and his latest splurge, as if they assumed I already knew about it. They had no idea that I'd been funding his life. One friend even dropped a bombshell. He'd heard that my brother had gotten involved in gambling. That immediately clicked for me. It explained why his need for money seemed to come in sudden waves, each one bigger than the last. With all these revelations in mind, I decided to call him and put everything on the table. I told him I'd seen the statements, I knew about the luxury spending, and I was done bailing him out unless he came clean. He didn't take it well. Instead of explaining or apologizing, he got defensive. He insisted he had everything under control and accused me of not trusting him. I was speechless. After all this, he still couldn't see the problem. That call ended with him practically begging for more help, but I'd finally reached my limit. For years, I'd brushed off my friend's advice, convinced that he was just a victim of bad luck and that things would turn around for him. But now I realized that I'd been blind. I'd been enabling his irresponsibility, funding a life I didn't even know he was living, and he hadn't been honest with me once. Feeling lost, I turned to my closest friends. I laid it all out for them, sparing no details. They weren't surprised. If anything, they were relieved I'd finally come around. A few of them encouraged me to cut ties, to let him face the consequences of his actions. I wasn't sure I could go that far just yet, but I knew I couldn't keep enabling him. It was time to draw a line. I decided I wasn't going to send him any more money, no matter how many times he called or texted. That decision felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. It wasn't about punishing him, it was about finally setting boundaries for myself. Of course, that didn't mean he accepted my decision. He bombarded me with messages and calls, trying every angle he could to get me to give in. He played the family card, then switched to guilt, saying he was at rock bottom and that our parents would want me to help him. But I stood firm. I didn't want to turn my back on him, but I couldn't keep sacrificing my own life to support his choices. Each time I ignored a call or text, I felt more resolved. I wasn't giving up on him, I was giving him the chance to grow up, to face the reality of his actions. And as much as it hurt, I knew it was the right thing to do. Update 2. Just a few days after I decided to stop helping my brother financially, a legal notice arrived at my house. It was addressed to him but sent to my address. I opened it without a second thought, figuring it would be another bill, but this one was different. It was a notice for unpaid rent on an apartment I didn't even know he had. Apparently he'd been living there for months, and he hadn't paid rent in almost as long. They were threatening eviction and legal action, unless he settled the overdue amount, which ran into the thousands. This was a shock to me. As far as I knew, my brother was renting a small, inexpensive place that I'd been helping to pay for. I hadn't realized he'd upgraded, let alone stopped paying rent. I decided I needed to see this place for myself, so I contacted the landlord and explained who I was. After some hesitation, he agreed to meet me at the apartment to discuss the outstanding payments. When I got there, I was stunned. It wasn't the modest apartment I'd imagined. It was in a trendy part of town, and the inside was filled with expensive furniture, gadgets, and decorations. This was no struggling guy's apartment. The landlord was polite but firm. He told me that my brother had been dodging him for months, always coming up with excuses for why he couldn't pay on time. Car trouble, medical bills, money coming soon. It was almost like hearing my own experiences repeated back to me. The landlord told me that he'd let things slide initially, but as the months went by, it became clear that my brother had no intention of catching up on rent. He seemed genuinely relieved when I explained that I wouldn't be covering the bill for him this time. He shared that he'd heard rumors about my brother's gambling habit and had his suspicions about where the money was really going. With the rent issue unresolved, I decided to go a step further and check my brother's bank statements to see just how bad things were. I'd managed to get hold of them before, so I used the same access. What I found confirmed the rumors. Transactions at casinos, online gambling sites, and massive withdrawals that didn't match his income were littered all over the statements. The amounts were staggering, way beyond what he could handle on his salary, and he'd been hiding it from me the whole time. But it didn't end there. In one of the transactions, I noticed a sale made to a local pawn shop. I knew this place, so I decided to go and see if I could find out what he'd sold. After speaking with the shop owner, I learned that my brother had pawned several pieces of family jewelry. These weren't just any items, they were heirlooms passed down from our parents, items that held sentimental value for both of us. It felt like a punch to the gut. I couldn't believe he'd sold these things without even asking me. I went back to his apartment, determined to confront him in person. When I got there, he was visibly uncomfortable but tried to play it cool. I laid it all out, everything I'd found. the gambling, the pawned jewelry, the lies about rent and bills. He didn't deny it outright, but he tried to dodge responsibility, claiming he'd gotten in over his head and was only trying to make things better for us. He started listing all these reasons for his actions: bad influences, tough breaks, high interest rates, anything but his own choices. Finally, I'd had enough. I told him that if he didn't come clean about everything, I'd report him to his creditors myself. I wasn't going to let him drag me down any further. That's when he broke down. He tearfully begged for one last chance, promising that he'd finally change, that this time would be different. He even tried to pull at my heartstrings, saying he felt like he'd let our parents down, that he needed just one more chance to prove he could be responsible. I decided to take a step back. I knew I couldn't trust his promises, no matter how convincing he sounded. I reached out to some family friends for advice, hoping to gain some perspective. They all said the same thing: I'd done more than enough, and it was time to let him face the consequences of his actions. I had to stop enabling him, even if it meant watching him struggle. So I made a decision. I told him he was on his own. I wasn't going to pay off his debts, cover his rent, or help with any more emergencies. I told him if he wanted to fix things, he'd have to do it himself. He tried to guilt trip me, bringing up our family history, how he was struggling, how he had no one else. But I stood firm. I knew that if I kept helping him, he'd never change. He'd keep coming back to me, expecting a bailout every time he hit a wall. Walking away wasn't easy. He kept calling and messaging, trying to get me to change my mind, promising he'd pay me back. But I'd finally realized that if I didn't stop, this cycle would go on forever. I wasn't helping him, I was only delaying the inevitable. And as hard as it was, I knew that letting him face the consequences was the best thing I could do, for both of us. Update 3. After cutting my brother off financially, I thought things would quiet down. But that turned out to be wishful thinking. It wasn't long before the phone calls started coming in. At first, I ignored the unknown numbers, thinking they were telemarketers or spam calls, but then I picked one up, and my heart sank. It was a debt collection agency, looking for my brother. They'd somehow tracked my number as an emergency contact or a last known address. They weren't just asking questions, they were demanding answers about where he was and when he'd be able to pay. I explained that I wasn't responsible for his debts, but it was clear they didn't care. The calls didn't stop there. More agencies followed, each one more aggressive than the last, calling at all hours. They'd ask if I could relay messages to my brother or provide his updated contact details. I told them I wasn't in touch with him, but that didn't stop them from asking if I'd be willing to help settle his debts. It was ridiculous. I felt like I'd somehow inherited all of his financial mess by default, simply because I was his older brother. A few days later, I learned just how far his debts had spread. I started getting letters in the mail addressed to him but sent to my address. They were piling up quickly: credit cards, payday loans, even notices from pawn shops. His financial troubles were spilling over into my life, and I knew I had to take action to protect myself. I reached out to him, asking him to handle his own mess, but he ignored my calls and messages. It was like he had vanished, leaving me to deal with the fallout. Things got even messier when distant family members started reaching out. Apparently, some of them had heard through the grapevine about his debts and his financial struggles, but the way they framed it, I was the villain in the story. They said things like, "Family sticks together, and your parents would want you to help him." Suddenly, I was being pressured to bail him out again, this time by people who hadn't been involved in our lives in years. It felt absurd, but they kept pushing, telling me I needed to do the right thing and save the family reputation. I refused, knowing that getting involved would only encourage his behavior. With the calls from debt collectors and family pressure mounting, I decided to consult a lawyer to protect my assets. I wanted to be sure that none of my finances were tied to his in any way, especially since creditors had started contacting me directly. During the consultation, I learned just how bad things could get if his debts were linked to any shared family accounts, or if he'd ever used my information as a cosigner. Thankfully, I hadn't co-signed anything, but the lawyer advised me to be cautious and document everything in case it escalated. Meanwhile, my brother finally decided to respond, but not to own up to his actions. Instead, he called me up, angry and defensive, accusing me of abandoning family and making his life harder. He claimed I was the reason he couldn't get back on his feet. According to him, he was at rock bottom because I had turned my back on him. It was as if he'd forgotten all the years I'd been bailing him out. He refused to take any responsibility, acting as if his debts were somehow my problem to fix. As the days passed, more secrets started coming out. I learned from a friend that my brother had taken out additional loans, ones he hadn't mentioned to me, with staggering interest rates. He'd even approached some mutual acquaintances for money, spinning sob stories about how his family had cut him off. He was manipulating anyone who would listen, using every connection he had to keep the money flowing. Each new debt I uncovered only confirmed what I'd already accepted. There was no bottom to this spiral. It became clear that he was going to keep running up debt unless someone intervened. As much as I hated the idea, I began seriously considering reporting him to his creditors. I didn't want to see him suffer, but I couldn't keep shouldering the burden of his choices, especially with debt collectors treating me like his point of contact. The stress was starting to wear on me. I found myself on edge all the time, dreading phone calls, worrying about my own finances. I couldn't sleep, and my work started suffering. Friends noticed, asking if I was okay, but I didn't want to burden anyone else with my family issues. It felt like my entire life was being hijacked by his poor choices. One evening, just as I was beginning to settle into some semblance of peace, there was a knock at my door. It was my brother, looking more disheveled than I'd ever seen him. He begged me for help again. claiming he had no one else to turn to. He told me he'd finally realized the damage he'd done and was ready to change. But after everything, I couldn't just take his word for it. I told him firmly that I was done helping him financially and that he had to face the consequences of his actions. The look on his face changed instantly. His desperation turned to anger as he accused me of abandoning him in his time of need. He blamed me for his troubles, calling me selfish and heartless. It was clear that he hadn't learned anything, and I wasn't going to let him guilt me into relenting. I told him, one last time, that he was on his own and closed the door. Walking away from him that night was a strange mix of sadness and relief. I felt like I was finally free from the cycle of lies and manipulation, even though it meant losing my brother in the process. It hurt, but I knew that stepping away was the only way forward. I was determined to rebuild my life and move on, focusing on my own future without the shadow of his debts hanging over me. For the first time in years, I could see a path forward that wasn't tied to his choices. And as painful as it was, I knew it was time to focus on my own life, free from the chaos he'd left behind. Update 4. After that last confrontation at my door, my brother didn't disappear quietly. Instead, it seemed like my decision to cut him off fueled a new kind of bitterness in him. A few days after shutting the door on him, I started hearing rumors through extended family. Apparently, he'd been telling anyone who would listen that I'd ruined his life by refusing to help him in his time of need. He painted a story where I was the ungrateful older brother who turned my back on him after years of helping him out, abandoning him when he was at rock bottom. It didn't stop there. He even dragged our late parents into it, saying that they would be disappointed in me for not stepping up to support family. Family members who hadn't been close to us in years suddenly started reaching out, demanding explanations. They'd clearly been listening to him, because their messages were filled with judgment. I received calls and messages from distant relatives, each conversation following the same pattern. They urged me to do the right thing and claimed it was my responsibility to help him out, as the older brother. I tried to explain the situation to those who would listen, walking them through everything I'd done for him over the years. But it was clear that many had already bought into his version of events. Some believed him outright, and others were simply unwilling to take sides, telling me to work it out. They wanted peace within the family, not drama, but they didn't see the sacrifices I'd made or the lies he'd told. It was frustrating, to say the least, and I quickly realized I couldn't change their minds. My friends, however, were a different story. They knew everything I'd been through, and they rallied around me. They reminded me of all the times I'd gone above and beyond for my brother and how this was the right choice, even if it was difficult. They saw through his manipulation and urged me to focus on myself for a change. Their support was like a lifeline in the middle of this chaos. Then, things took a turn for the worse. My brother decided to take his grievances online, posting on social media about how I'd abandoned him. He didn't mention me by name, but anyone close to us knew exactly who he was talking about. He painted himself as the victim, claiming he was struggling to make ends meet and that his family had turned their backs on him. His posts were filled with stories of hardship and betrayal, designed to pull at people's heartstrings. Within hours, I started getting messages from people who'd seen his posts, asking me how I could be so cold-hearted. It was unbelievable. Concerned that this would harm my reputation, I decided to consult a lawyer to see if there was anything I could do. I didn't want to escalate things further, but I also couldn't stand by while he publicly dragged my name through the mud. The lawyer advised me to document everything, screenshots of the posts, records of my financial help over the years, and any messages he'd sent accusing me. It was a relief to know I could protect myself, even if it felt extreme to get legal advice for a family matter. I hadn't wanted it to come to this, but it was clear he wasn't going to stop on his own. In the meantime, I heard through a mutual friend that my brother's debt had reached critical levels. He was essentially bankrupt, with no one left willing to lend him a hand. He had used up every favor, burned every bridge. While part of me felt bad knowing he'd hit rock bottom, there was also a strange sense of relief. It was a relief knowing I hadn't gone down with him, that I'd managed to step back before his spiral could destroy me financially as well. At this point, I made a decision. I set a firm boundary with my family. I let them know that I wouldn't discuss my brother's situation anymore. They could believe whatever they wanted, but I was done explaining myself. I made it clear that I wasn't going to pay any more of his debts or get involved in any family interventions. I wasn't cutting myself off from family entirely, but I needed them to understand that my decision was final. If they couldn't respect that, I wasn't going to engage with them on the topic. With that boundary in place, I started focusing on my own life. My finances, which had taken a serious hit over the years, were finally stabilizing. I no longer had to worry about unexpected calls for help or surprise expenses. I could budget and plan for myself without the fear that his problems would derail everything. It was a strange feeling, like I was finally free to build a future that was entirely my own. I also noticed my health improving. The stress of his constant demands had been weighing on me for so long that I'd forgotten what it was like to feel at ease. I started sleeping better, spending more time with friends, and even reconnecting with old hobbies I'd put aside. I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in years. Rediscovering my independence was bittersweet, though. Cutting him off wasn't what I'd wanted, and the loss of family connections stung. But I reminded myself that this wasn't just a one-time decision. It was a culmination of years of manipulation, lies, and betrayal. Setting boundaries was the only way I could protect myself, and I finally understood that doing so didn't make me a bad brother. It just made me a responsible one. For the first time in a long time, I could see a future that wasn't tied down by his chaos. I was rebuilding from scratch, finding my footing, and allowing myself to hope for a peaceful life. Update 5. Months after cutting my brother out of my life, things were finally quiet. Life was different, peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Without his constant demands and crises, I finally had the time and space to focus on myself. My finances were in a better place. No surprise expenses popping up, no debt collectors hounding me about someone else's problems. I was even able to rebuild my savings, something that had seemed impossible for so long. At first, I felt a strange emptiness in the quiet, almost like I was waiting for the next call or message from him. But over time, that feeling faded, replaced by a sense of relief. I could make plans, set goals, and not worry about the possibility of having to drop everything to deal with his latest emergency. A few family members were still distant, but I didn't let it bother me. I knew where I stood and why I'd made my choices, and that was enough. With my life starting to feel normal again, I began reaching out to old friends. They'd heard bits and pieces of what I'd been through, and they were more than supportive, welcoming me back with open arms. It was like reconnecting with pieces of myself I'd lost along the way. We'd grab coffee, talk about things that had nothing to do with family drama, and they encouraged me to pick up old hobbies and interests I'd set aside during the years I was focused on my brother. At one point, a friend suggested therapy. It was something I'd considered before but hadn't seriously looked into. Now, though, with the weight of everything that had happened, it felt like the right time. I found a therapist who specialized in family dynamics and manipulation, and over the next few months I began processing everything, years of guilt, manipulation, and the feeling of obligation I'd carried. Therapy helped me understand how I'd been enabling my brother, how his problems had become a trap that I'd fallen into willingly, even if I'd resented it. Talking it all out brought a kind of clarity I hadn't known I needed. I learned how to set boundaries, not just with him, but with others in my life. For the first time, I felt like I had the tools to protect myself from situations like this in the future. The support didn't stop there. I joined a local support group for people dealing with difficult family members, and it was eye-opening. Hearing similar stories made me realize just how common this kind of thing was, and that I wasn't alone. Each meeting, I saw more clearly how letting go was an act of self-respect, not selfishness. Then, out of nowhere, my brother reached out. He claimed he'd finally hit rock bottom and wanted to turn things around. His message was surprisingly humble, nothing like the angry, defensive tone he'd used the last time we'd spoken. He said he'd been through a lot, that he'd finally realized the damage he'd caused, and he genuinely wanted to change. I read the message more than once, feeling torn. Part of me wanted to believe him, to think that he could really change. But after everything, I knew better than to jump in headfirst. I replied cautiously, letting him know that I was open to hearing him out, but that I couldn't offer any financial help. Almost immediately, he responded, asking for a small loan to get back on his feet. He promised he'd pay it back, that this was the last thing he needed to make a fresh start. That was all I needed to hear. My answer was simple, no. I reminded him that I'd already given him everything I could and that he'd have to find a way to rebuild on his own. His reaction was instant. He sent a string of angry messages, accusing me of abandoning him, of being heartless. It was like he hadn't learned anything. His tone was exactly the same as it had been before. That anger, that entitlement, it showed me he wasn't ready to change. I didn't reply. Instead, I took it as confirmation that keeping my distance was the right decision. I finally blocked his number, knowing that without this constant cycle, I could truly move on. With that door firmly closed, I began setting goals for myself. There were things I'd put off for years, travel, learning a new skill, even simple career goals I'd never focused on because I was always on call for my brother's next crisis. I booked a solo trip to a place I'd always wanted to visit, started taking classes to learn a new language, and set new financial goals. It felt incredible to finally put myself first. Over time, a few family members who had initially sided with him began reaching out, some of them apologizing for doubting me. They admitted they hadn't known the full story and had only heard his side. It was good to have that support, but I was careful to keep boundaries in place. I didn't want to be drawn into drama or guilted into doing anything for him. My peace of mind had become too valuable to risk. As I reflected on everything, I realized this journey had taught me more about myself than I'd expected. I'd spent years thinking that helping my brother was my responsibility, that family loyalty meant sacrificing myself. Now, I understood that setting boundaries was an act of respect for myself and, strangely enough, for him. By stepping back, I'd given him the opportunity to face his own choices and grow. Whether he'd ever do that was out of my hands, but I knew I'd done what was right for me. In the end, letting go was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but it was also the most freeing. I'd found a life that was mine to shape, free from manipulation and financial strain. For the first time in a long time, I felt whole. I'm a 35-year-old guy, and a few years ago, I thought I was doing something incredible for my family. I worked hard in tech, landed a great job, and after grinding for years, I saved up enough to pay off my parents' $150,000 mortgage. It felt like the right thing to do. My parents sacrificed so much for me growing up, working long hours, skipping vacations, and putting their kids first. Paying off their mortgage was my way of saying thank you for all they did. At first, it was amazing. My parents were thrilled. They threw a little party at their house, invited some close friends and family, and couldn't stop talking about how proud they were of me. My dad kept saying things like, "We raised such a good son," and my mom was beaming with pride. They even shared the news with our extended family, which led to a flood of congratulatory messages. For a few weeks, I felt like I'd made the best decision of my life. But then things started to change. It began subtly. A few weeks after the mortgage was paid off, my parents mentioned needing help with groceries. I figured, why not? I had the money, and it wasn't a big deal. Then it was the electric bill. Then a car repair. Again, these seemed like small things, so I didn't think much of it. But over the next few months, the requests started coming more frequently. A couple $100s here, a few thousand there. Eventually, they asked me to cover their health insurance premiums, and when they wanted to take a vacation, they asked if I could help pay for that too. Meanwhile, my younger brother and sister were noticeably absent from these conversations. My brother is 32, and my sister is 28. Both of them claimed they couldn't afford to help out. My brother is always complaining about how tight money is, even though he spends every weekend at expensive breweries with his friends. My sister, on the other hand, loves to post about her shopping hauls and weekend getaways, but insists she's barely scraping by. I didn't want to cause drama, so I kept quiet and shouldered the financial burden myself. Things came to a head when my parents asked me to co-sign a $50,000 loan for home renovations. They wanted to redo the kitchen and build a deck, and while I could technically afford it, I didn't feel comfortable co-signing. I politely declined, explaining that I'd already helped a lot and needed to focus on my own financial goals. That's when the guilt trip started. My mom would say things like, "We gave up so much for you when you were growing up." And my dad chimed in with, "Family always helps family." They acted like I was the bad guy for saying no. Then my siblings jumped in, accusing me of being selfish. It didn't matter that they weren't offering to co-sign or contribute a dime. I was the one being unreasonable, apparently. Around this time, my parents made a big announcement. They were quitting their part-time jobs. They said they wanted to enjoy retirement and that they could do so because they knew I'd always take care of everything. That was news to me. I told them I'd help with some bills here and there, but I wasn't funding their lifestyle. That didn't go over well. They started giving me the silent treatment, which escalated into them telling extended family members that I was ungrateful and abandoning them. Before long, my phone was blowing up with calls and texts from aunts, uncles, and cousins, all telling me how disappointed they were in me. Some said things like, "Your parents sacrificed so much for you. The least you can do is take care of them now." Others were harsher, calling me a disgrace for turning my back on family. What really pushed me over the edge was when I discovered my parents had taken out a small loan in my name without telling me. I only found out when I got a notification from the bank about a missed payment. They'd apparently assumed I wouldn't mind and that I'd just pay it off like I had everything else. That was the final straw. I confronted them about it, and they didn't even seem to understand why I was upset. They brushed it off as something they did for the family and insisted I was overreacting. At that moment, I realized just how far things had spiraled out of control. What started as a heartfelt gesture to help my parents had turned into a nightmare of guilt, manipulation, and entitlement. This is where the real story begins. I wish I could say that was the worst of it, but things only got messier from here. Update 1. When I found out about the unauthorized loan, I drove straight to my parents' house. I didn't call ahead. I didn't trust myself to stay calm if I gave them time to prepare excuses. As soon as I walked in, I put the loan papers on the table and demanded an explanation. They looked surprised but didn't deny it. My mom waved it off, saying it was just a small loan and they took it for the family. My dad chimed in, saying they assumed I wouldn't mind since I've always helped out. I told them this wasn't okay and that they had crossed a line. They didn't take me seriously. My mom started listing all the things they'd done for me growing up, as if that justified it. My dad got defensive, saying, "We didn't think it was a big deal." I left their house frustrated, knowing they weren't going to take responsibility. The next day, I called my bank and explained the situation. They confirmed that the loan was in my name and had already missed a payment, which could impact my credit. I immediately contacted a lawyer to figure out my options. He advised me to send a formal dispute letter to the bank and document everything. It felt surreal having to involve legal professionals against my own parents, but I knew I couldn't let this slide. While I was sorting out the legal side, my parents started bombarding me with calls. Some were apologetic, with my mom crying and saying they didn't mean to upset me. Others were angry, accusing me of overreacting and making a big deal out of nothing. The guilt trips were relentless. My dad even said they only did it because they trusted me to take care of it. My siblings jumped into the mix too. My brother called to tell me I was being ridiculous and that it was just money. My sister said I should get over it because I was financially stable and could afford to help. Neither of them seemed to care that our parents had forged my name to take out a loan. It got to a point where I couldn't handle the constant calls and messages. I blocked my parents and both siblings on my phone and social media. For the first time in years, I had some peace, but it didn't last long. A week later, my extended family staged an intervention. I showed up thinking it was a normal family dinner, but it quickly became clear they had other plans. My aunts, uncles, and even a couple of cousins were there, all ready to talk some sense into me. They accused me of abandoning my parents and letting money come between family. Some even suggested I should apologize for upsetting them. It was absurd. I stood my ground explaining what had happened with the loan, but it was clear most of them didn't care. They saw me as the ungrateful son who was refusing to support his parents. Not everyone sided against me, though. After the intervention, a couple of my cousins pulled me aside. They said they'd been in similar situations, with my parents pressuring them for money over the years. One cousin even shared how my parents had borrowed money from her parents and never paid it back. That's when I learned my parents had a history of financial manipulation, going as far back as their own parents. Apparently, my grandparents' savings were drained in a similar way before they passed. I vented about all of this to a close friend who didn't sugarcoat anything. He told me I needed to cut financial ties completely, no matter how guilty I felt. It wasn't an easy decision, but I knew he was right. I started drafting a formal letter to my parents, outlining exactly what I would and wouldn't cover moving forward. I wanted it in writing so there'd be no confusion or excuses later. Before I could send the letter, my parents escalated things. They started sending me lengthy voice messages and handwritten letters. Some were filled with emotional pleas saying I was ruining their lives. Others were outright nasty, accusing me of being selfish and heartless. To make matters worse, they took their complaints to their church community. People I barely knew started reaching out, urging me to reconcile with my parents and do the right thing. The public shaming was humiliating, but I refused to back down. I decided to take a hard look at my finances to see just how much I'd spent on them over the years. The numbers shocked me. Between the mortgage, bills, and other expenses, I had already spent over $200,000 on them. Seeing it laid out like that made me realize how unsustainable this had become. Finally, I sent the letter. In it, I stated that I would no longer cover any expenses beyond occasional emergencies, and even then, only if I was asked directly. I made it clear I wouldn't tolerate any more manipulation. It wasn't easy hitting send, but I felt a weight lift off my shoulders once I did. I wish I could say that ended the drama, but it didn't. My parents didn't take the boundaries well, and their response only made things more complicated. If anything, this was just the beginning. Update 2. I thought things couldn't get worse after I sent the letter outlining my boundaries, but I was wrong. A month later, I got another notification from the bank. My parents had missed 2 payments on the loan they took out in my name. This time, it hit my credit score. I immediately called the bank to find out what was going on. They confirmed the missed payments and warned me that if the loan defaulted, it would severely impact my financial standing. At that point, I realized I had no choice but to take legal action. My lawyer explained the steps we could take to have me removed from the loan and protect my credit. It would involve filing a formal complaint with the bank and potentially pursuing a fraud case against my own parents. It sounded extreme, but I was running out of options. When my parents caught wind of this, they completely lost it. They called me furious, saying I was trying to ruin their lives. My mom told me that if I went through with the fraud case, they would disown me. My dad accused me of tearing the family apart and claimed I was acting like a stranger, not their son. It wasn't just them either, my siblings jumped in to back them up. My brother said I was being petty over a few missed payments, and my sister insisted I was abandoning them in their time of need. The extended family got involved again too. My inbox filled up with messages from aunts, uncles, and even people I hadn't spoken to in years. Some were long-winded guilt trips, others were outright hostile, but the theme was the same: I was the bad guy for not being a good son. That was the final straw. My lawyer suggested sending a cease and desist letter to my parents, specifically regarding any further financial requests. The letter made it clear that if they tried to take out another loan in my name or involve me in their financial mess, I'd take immediate legal action. Once the letter was delivered, the calls from my parents stopped, at least for a few days. Then they retaliated. I got a call from my HR department at work. Apparently, my parents had contacted my employer, claiming I had stolen money from them and was being investigated for fraud. Luckily, I had already informed my boss about the situation, so they didn't take the claim seriously. Instead, my boss reassured me that my job was safe and advised me to file a police report to protect myself. Filing that report felt like crossing a line I never wanted to cross, but I knew it was necessary. I documented everything: the unauthorized loan, the missed payments, and the false claims to my employer. The police took the report seriously and assured me it would help if things escalated further. While I was dealing with the legal side, my parents were busy spreading rumors in their community. A family friend reached out to warn me that my parents were telling people at their church that I had stolen money from them and left them to fend for themselves. Some of the messages I received from church members were almost laughable, accusing me of being greedy and ungrateful. Others were downright threatening, telling me I'd regret betraying my parents. Amid all this chaos, a close friend reminded me of something I hadn't considered. I'd already done more than enough. I had paid off their mortgage, covered countless bills, and spent over $200,000 on them. My friend told me, "They're not entitled to a single cent more. You owe them nothing." Hearing that gave me the clarity I needed to move forward. I made the decision to cut all financial support entirely. Through my lawyer, I sent a formal notice to my parents, stating that I would no longer cover any expenses or be involved in their financial decisions. I also informed the bank that I was pursuing legal action to remove myself from the loan. Even with everything going on, it was hard not to feel the emotional weight of the situation. These were my parents, the people who raised me, and now I was treating them like adversaries. Despite everything they'd done, I couldn't help but mourn the relationship we once had. As word spread through the family about what was happening, more cousins started reaching out. Some shared their own stories of being financially manipulated by my parents. One cousin revealed that my parents had convinced her to loan them money for a business opportunity years ago, which they never paid back. Another cousin admitted he'd been guilted into covering their medical bills after my grandfather passed. It became clear that this wasn't just about me. This was a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for years. Looking back, it's hard to believe how far things spiraled. What started as a generous gesture paying off their mortgage had turned into a nightmare of entitlement, manipulation, and betrayal. If I'd known how things would unfold, I might have done things differently. But now, all I can do is protect myself and move forward. Update 3. Just when I thought things couldn't escalate further, I was served with legal papers. My parents were suing me, claiming I had promised them lifelong financial support. The lawsuit alleged that by paying off their mortgage and helping them financially over the years, I had entered into an informal agreement to take care of them indefinitely. It was ridiculous, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. The first thing I did was gather every piece of evidence I had: emails, texts, receipts, anything that showed I had never agreed to anything beyond what I had already done. The messages from my parents and siblings accusing me of abandoning them became key pieces of evidence. I also included the cease and desist letter I'd sent, which clearly outlined my boundaries. When the court date was set, things took an even stranger turn. My siblings informed me through mutual relatives that they were going to testify on behalf of my parents. They claimed they were doing it to protect the family. It was a gut punch, but I wasn't surprised. They had always backed our parents, no matter how unreasonable they were. In the days leading up to the trial, a cousin reached out to me with unexpected news. She had evidence of her own. Years ago, my parents had borrowed money from her parents under the guise of a loan and never repaid it. She also had messages showing how my parents had guilted and manipulated other family members into giving them money. She offered to testify on my behalf, and I immediately shared this with my lawyer. The trial itself was a spectacle. The courtroom was packed with family members, many of whom had clearly picked sides. My parents sat with my siblings, looking confident and defiant. They painted themselves as victims, claiming they had sacrificed everything for me and that I was now abandoning them in their time of need. My siblings backed them up, recounting stories that painted me as selfish and ungrateful. When it was my turn, my lawyer presented the evidence I'd gathered. We showed the court the messages from my parents pressuring me for money, the receipts for the mortgage payments, and the bank notifications about the unauthorized loan. The cousin who had offered to testify took the stand and shared her story, detailing how my parents had manipulated her family in the past. Her testimony was powerful, and it visibly shook my parents. The judge didn't take long to make a decision. After reviewing all the evidence, he ruled in my favor. He stated that I had no legal obligation to support my parents financially, and that their claims were baseless. It was a huge relief, but the drama didn't end there. As soon as the ruling was announced, my parents caused a scene in the courtroom. They shouted about how heartless I was and accused me of tearing the family apart. My siblings joined in, loudly blaming me for destroying our family. It was embarrassing, but I kept my composure and left the courtroom without engaging. The fallout from the trial was immediate. My parents' legal fees drained their savings, forcing them to sell their house. They tried to frame it as my fault, but most people saw through it. Some family members who had initially sided with them began to distance themselves. Others, however, doubled down on their support for my parents, cutting ties with me entirely. The public backlash hit my parents hard. Word about the lawsuits spread in their church community, and their once spotless reputation took a major hit. Some church members who had been vocal in shaming me reached out to apologize, admitting they hadn't known the full story. Others stuck by my parents, continuing to spread rumors and stir up drama. I made one last attempt to reconcile. I wrote a letter to my parents, explaining my side of the story and why I had made the decisions I did. I apologized for the pain caused but made it clear I couldn't continue being their financial safety net. They refused to read it, according to a mutual relative, and returned the letter unopened. To my surprise, a local newspaper picked up the story. They framed it as a family drama, detailing how a generous son's good deed spiraled into a legal battle. The article was surprisingly fair, but seeing my family's dysfunction laid out for public consumption was surreal. For the first time in years, I felt free. The financial and emotional burden my parents had placed on me was finally gone. I could focus on my own life without constantly worrying about their next demand. I started rebuilding, taking on new projects at work, and reconnecting with friends I'd neglected during the chaos. My siblings cut all contact, blaming me for the fallout. I was okay with that. I had done everything I could to help them see the truth, but they had chosen their side. Meanwhile, some extended family members began reaching out to me, apologizing for not supporting me earlier. Slowly, I started to rebuild those relationships. As difficult as it was to go through, the trial was the closure I needed. I finally had the space to move forward and create a life without the shadow of my parents' expectations looming over me. It wasn't the ending I had hoped for, but it was the one I needed. Update 4. After the courtroom drama, things settled into an uneasy quiet. My parents sold their house and moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town. It wasn't a smooth transition. Word from mutual relatives was that they were struggling to make ends meet. Without the safety net of my financial support, they had to rely on their dwindling savings and my siblings for help. My siblings, who had been so vocal about defending our parents during the trial, were now feeling the pressure. They began to complain to relatives that the financial burden was too much for them to handle. My brother, who had always claimed he couldn't afford to help, suddenly found himself paying for rent and utilities. My sister, who had sided with my parents through everything, started venting to others about how much they were asking of her. Neither of them reached out to me directly, but the whispers through the family grapevine painted a clear picture. Despite all of this, I kept my distance. I maintained the no-contact boundary I had set with my parents. They tried a few times to reach out, through letters, messages sent through relatives, and even showing up uninvited at my apartment. I ignored every attempt. I knew any engagement would only pull me back into their cycle of manipulation. Surprisingly, a few family members who had originally sided with my parents began to change their tune. Some cousins and even an aunt who had criticized me reached out to apologize. They admitted they had been quick to judge without knowing the full story. A couple of them even shared stories about how my parents had tried to manipulate them in the past, which only confirmed everything I already knew. What I didn't expect was how my siblings' attitudes would slowly shift. At first, they avoided me entirely, blaming me for the fallout. But over time, as they dealt with the reality of my parents' demands, cracks began to form in their loyalty. Through mutual relatives, I heard that my brother had started calling out my parents' behavior, saying it wasn't fair to expect him to shoulder all the responsibility. My sister, too, began to acknowledge how manipulative they had been, not just to me, but to everyone in the family. The cousins who had supported me from the beginning became a real lifeline. We started spending more time together, bonding over shared experiences. A few of them had also dealt with financially demanding parents or relatives, so they understood what I had been through. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a solid support system. Freed from the constant financial strain, I was finally able to focus on my career. I threw myself into work, took on new responsibilities, and even earned a promotion. It felt good to channel my energy into something productive instead of constantly worrying about my parents' next demand. With my financial stability no longer at risk, I started thinking about my future again. Meanwhile, the rumors from my parents persisted. They continued telling anyone who would listen that I had abandoned them and left them penniless. At first, it was hard to ignore, but as time went on, I stopped caring. Their stories became less believable as more people in the family and community began to see through them. Even within their church, the narrative started to shift. A few members who had been staunchly on their side reached out to me, apologizing for judging me. Some even mentioned that they had started questioning my parents' version of events after hearing about the lawsuit and the details that came out in court. It was a small victory, but it showed that the truth was slowly coming to light. Holidays were the hardest part of all this. For the first time in my life, I spent Thanksgiving and Christmas without my immediate family. Instead, I celebrated with friends and a few supportive cousins. We created our own traditions, small, intimate gatherings that were free from drama. It felt strange at first, but eventually became something I looked forward to. The turning point with my siblings came about a year after the trial. My sister reached out, asking for advice on how to deal with our parents. She was overwhelmed by their constant demands and didn't know how to set boundaries. I agreed to talk, but I made it clear that I wouldn't get dragged back into the same dynamic. We started communicating again, cautiously at first, but it felt good to have even a small connection. Through other relatives, I heard that my parents had started expressing regret. They didn't apologize directly, of course they were too proud for that, but their actions spoke volumes. They stopped trying to reach out and seemed resigned to the consequences of their choices. Looking back, it's been a long, difficult journey, but I'm proud of how far I've come. I stood up for myself in ways I never thought I could, and I've built a life that feels truly my own. The chaos and manipulation are behind me, and for the first time in years, I feel free to focus on the future. I don't know what's next, but for now, I'm content with where I am. I've learned the value of boundaries, the importance of self-respect, and the strength it takes to walk away from toxic relationships, even when they're family. It's not the ending I imagined, but it's the one I needed. Update 5. A few months after the dust seemed to have settled, I got a call from an estate attorney. A distant relative, whom I barely knew, had passed away and left a small inheritance. To my surprise, the inheritance was split evenly, $50,000 each to me, my parents, and my siblings. It seemed straightforward, money I could use to solidify my financial future, but I should have known it wouldn't be that simple. Word of the inheritance spread quickly through the family. Before I had even decided what to do with the money, my parents reached out, demanding that I hand over my portion. Their argument was that they deserved it as compensation for everything they'd been through, including the lawsuit. They framed it as me righting a wrong and claimed the money should go to them to help with their living expenses. It didn't take long for my siblings to pile on. My brother told mutual relatives that I owed the family for the stress I had caused, and my sister parroted the same line. They both insisted that I should give up the inheritance for the sake of family unity. Their reasoning? My parents were struggling financially, and since I was doing well, I could afford to help. I refused. I made it clear that the money was going toward my future, not their demands. My parents didn't take this lightly. They launched another smear campaign, this time claiming I was stealing money that was meant for the family. They told anyone who would listen that the inheritance should have gone to them in full and that my refusal to share was proof of my selfishness. The backlash was immediate. Members of their church started contacting me, urging me to do the right thing and support my parents. The messages ranged from guilt-laden appeals to outright accusations, calling me greedy and heartless. It felt like déjà vu, another round of public shaming orchestrated by my parents. But then, something unexpected happened. A former family friend from their church, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, stepped in to defend me. This friend had a long history with my parents and publicly shared stories about their manipulative tendencies. She exposed how they had guilted and pressured others in the past, even within the church community. Her testimony shifted the narrative, and many people who had been quick to judge began questioning my parents' version of events. Meanwhile, my siblings weren't faring well. The financial strain of supporting my parents had caught up with them. My brother, who had always claimed he was barely scraping by, faced mounting debts from covering their rent and utilities. My sister, who had initially dismissed my concerns, was now venting to relatives about how much money our parents were asking for. It was clear that their loyalty was being tested. Out of nowhere, my sister reached out to me privately. She admitted that our parents were financially draining her and that she felt trapped. She apologized for siding against me during the lawsuit and confessed that she hadn't realized how manipulative they were until she became their primary source of support. It wasn't easy for her to admit, but it opened the door for us to have an honest conversation. Together, we started discussing ways to handle our parents without falling back into old patterns. I shared what had worked for me, setting firm boundaries and refusing to give in to guilt. My sister, determined to avoid the same pitfalls, began making plans to limit how much financial help she would provide. Then our parents announced their next move. They were planning to sell what little they had left and move in with my sister. She was furious but didn't back down. She agreed to let them stay under strict conditions, making it clear that she wouldn't tolerate the manipulation or entitlement they had shown in the past. She set boundaries from the outset, ensuring they understood that this arrangement wasn't permanent or unconditional. I offered to help her set up a financial plan, advising her on how to protect herself and avoid being drained the way I had been. Together, we created a system where she could monitor expenses and keep their demands in check. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. Predictably, our parents didn't take kindly to these boundaries. They lashed out, accusing both of us of being ungrateful and threatening to disown us, a hollow threat considering they had already cut ties with me after the lawsuit. Their anger only solidified our resolve to stick to the limits we had set. In an unexpected twist, this whole ordeal brought my sister and me closer. For years, we had been on opposite sides, but now we were united by our shared struggle. We started rebuilding our relationship, finding common ground in our experiences. It felt good to have someone in the family who truly understood what I had been through. As for my parents, they remained bitter and resistant to change. They continued to spread rumors and play the victim, but their influence was waning. More and more family members began seeing through their tactics, leaving them with fewer allies. Looking back, I never could have predicted how things would unfold. What started as a battle over financial boundaries had turned into a complete reshaping of my relationships, with my parents, my siblings, and even myself. It wasn't easy, but for the first time, I felt like I was finally free to live my life on my own terms.